Tragedy on Lake Baikal. Tourist bus plunges through ice. A devastating accident unfolded on frozen surface of Lake Baikal in Siberia when a minibus carrying tourists broke through the ice and sank within seconds, killing several people. Russian authorities confirmed that 7 Chinese tourists and a Russian driver lost their lives after the vehicle plunged into the icy waters. Now it's time to go in detail and uncover the full story in today's AI podcast.
There is a very specific kind of silence you only really get in Siberia.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just the absence of noise, you
Yeah.
know. It's the actual presence of the cold. Just imagine standing on the surface of Lake Baikal.
In the dead of winter.
Right, in February. The air is so crisp it almost hurts. The sky is massive. And right beneath your feet is this sheet of ice that, well, it looks less like a frozen lake and more like a perfectly polished gem.
Yeah, it is breathtaking. It really
This
is.
is the kind of place that totally ruins you for other landscapes because nothing else feels quite this big or this wild.
It's the crown jewel of Russia's wilderness, without a doubt. But the thing about wilderness, like true wilderness, is that it is completely indifferent.
Yeah.
It doesn't care if you're out there to take a beautiful photo for social media or if you've traveled 3,000 miles just to see it. And on Baikal, that indifference can and does turn lethal in an absolute heartbeat.
Which brings us to today's deep dive. We are looking at a source today titled Fatal Fissures, The Perils of Baikal's Winter Ice.
A really sobering piece.
Very. It documents a recent tragedy involving a minibus full of tourists. But honestly, as I was reading through this material, the more I realized this isn't just about one isolated accident.
No, not at all.
It's this profound look at how we interact with dangerous environments, the actual physics of ice, and I think this is the craziest part, the really strange psychology of tourists who just blatantly ignore warnings.
It really is a case study in risk assessment, or I guess the total failure of risk assessment.
Exactly.
We have this incident where 8 people lost their lives, but the context surrounding it, what happened right before and incredibly right after, is what makes this a deep dive rather than just a quick news brief.
So let's go on onto the ice. We have a minibus. It's driving across the frozen surface of the lake near Olkan Island, which that's this really popular hub for winter tourism.
Right, highly trafficked area.
And inside this van, you have a driver and 7 passengers.
Specifically, the source notes it was 7 tourists from China and 1 Russian driver. And among those passengers, there was a 14-year-old child.
God, that's heavy.
It is, and they are driving along, probably just enjoying that surreal, beautiful experience of being out on the water, but not actually in the water.
Until the physics of the lake just completely changed on them. There's a phrase in the source that really stuck with me. It says, the vehicle sank within seconds.
Within seconds.
That doesn't sound like, the ice slowly cracking and groaning under the weight of the tires.
No, and that is a really crucial distinction to make here. Usually when we hear about vehicles going through ice, we picture this gradual, terrifying failure.
Like in the movies.
Exactly. The ice bows down, you get those spiderweb cracks shooting out, water starts seeping up around the tires, and maybe, just maybe, the driver has a moment to kick open a door.
But this was different.
Completely different. The bus didn't break the ice, it fell into a void.
The source calls it a 3-meter wide ice fissure.
Right. 3 meters. Just think about the width of a standard lane on a highway.
Huge.
That's roughly 3 meters. So this wasn't a crack in the ice. It was literally an open canyon of water that just appeared in the ice sheet.
But how does a gap that big just sit there?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, shouldn't it be totally obvious to a driver?
Not necessarily, no, because Baikal is a highly dynamic system. It's not like a backyard swimming pool that just freezes over evenly and stays put.
Right. It's essentially an inland sea.
Exactly. The water levels fluctuate underneath, the temperature swings wildly from day to night, and all that ice expands and contracts constantly. It's always moving, almost like tectonic plates in slow motion.
Or sometimes fast motion, I guess.
Right. These fissures open up suddenly when the immense tension in the ice sheet finally releases.
So you have this massive gap, maybe gets covered up by a thin layer of new ice overnight, or just a dusting of snow, and this driver is moving at speed.
And suddenly the ground just isn't there anymore.
Just gone.
That completely explains that within seconds timeline the source mentioned, the vehicle would have just pitched forward violently into the gap. In that scenario, the whole orientation of the bus changes instantly. You aren't sitting in a car anymore.
They're falling in a metal box.
You're plummeting.
The chaos inside that vehicle must have been absolute. The source mentions there was one survivor, which, frankly, Reading that, it seems almost impossible given the speed of the sinking.
It is miraculous. It truly is. Governor Igor Kobzev actually confirmed that one of the Chinese tourists somehow managed to escape.
Do we know how?
We don't have their specific testimony of how they got out in the source material, but physically speaking, the odds are stacked so heavily against you in that exact moment.
Because of the cold shock, right?
Oh, the cold shock response is immediate. The water there is barely above freezing. The second it hits your chest, it forces you to inhale involuntarily.
Which means you're swallowing water instantly.
Right. And then you have the sheer pressure of the water outside holding the van door shut until the entire interior fills up and equalizes the pressure.
And the darkness. That's the part that gets me. Once that bus goes under the ice, you aren't just underwater, you're under a ceiling.
A thick, solid ceiling that blocks out almost all the light. It's a terrifying, disorienting scenario. And tragically, for the other 8 people in that van, including the driver and that teenager, there was no escape. They were trapped.
Just awful. And the aftermath described in the source paints a really grim picture of the recovery effort, too. It wasn't a rescue operation for long. It became a recovery mission almost immediately.
Because of the depth.
Right, the depth they were talking about is roughly 18 meters.
Which is almost 60 feet down.
Yeah.
That puts it well beyond the reach of any kind of casual intervention. You can't just have a bystander hold their breath and dive down to check on them.
No, you need serious gear.
The source actually notes the rescue teams had to use underwater cameras just to locate the vehicle on the lake bed because the visibility was so incredibly poor.
I think people really underestimate how difficult an underwater recovery is in winter conditions like this. It's not just a matter of swimming down and attaching a hook to the bumper.
Not at all.
You're dealing with freezing equipment, potential underwater currents, and a massive risk to the divers themselves.
Absolutely. Think about it. The divers are voluntarily entering the exact same trap that killed the tourists.
Right, because the ice is still shifting above them.
Exactly. If the ice shifts again while they're down there, their entry point could close up or move. It is a wildly high-stakes operation just to retrieve the victims.
Which naturally brings us to the big question of why they were even out there in the first place. Because you mentioned earlier that Baikal is this wild place, but it's also a highly regulated space, isn't it? You can't just drive a truck wherever you want.
Theoretically, no, you can't. Governor Kobzev was very explicit in his public statement following the accident. He stated that going out on the ice in that specific area is, quote, mortally dangerous, and, more importantly, it was currently prohibited.
So there was an active ban in place.
Full prohibition. But this is where the dark side of adventure tourism comes into play. The source specifies that these tourists were traveling independently.
Which is a very polite way of saying unauthorized, right?
Essentially, yes. They weren't part of a sanctioned official tour group. In regions like Baikal, you have the official economy. These are licensed operators who constantly monitor the Ministry of Emergency Situations reports.
They check the ice thickness.
They check the charts, they map the safe routes, and they generally follow the law because they want to keep their operating licenses and keep people safe.
And then you have the shadow economy.
Correct. Local drivers with private vehicles who are more than willing to take serious risks for a cash fare.
Yeah.
If a tourist wants to see the famous transparent blue ice and the official operators say, no, sorry, it's unsafe today, the tourist might just go look for someone who says yes.
It's a demand-driven danger. These tourists, they've traveled all the way from China to Siberia. They probably have an itinerary and a checklist. See the transparent ice, take the photo.
Get the experience.
Right, so if the legitimate business says the shop is closed, they just go to the back door.
And that independent driver is likely thinking, hey, I've driven this lake 1,000 times. I know the ice. It's a classic case of normalizing a deadly risk. Just because you survived the drive yesterday doesn't mean the physical mechanics of the ice haven't completely changed today.
The source mentions a criminal investigation has actually been launched into this.
Yes, specifically checking for safety regulation violations. When 8 people die in a single event, the authorities have to look very closely at who facilitated that trip.
Right.
It's not just categorized as a tragic traffic accident. It's arguably negligent homicide if someone knowingly bypassed active safety bans to take paying customers out there. Though obviously in this case, the driver paid with his life as well.
It's tragic all around.
Yeah.
But I really want to zoom out to the location itself for a minute because I feel like the sheer scale of Baikal contributes to this false sense of security people get.
It definitely does.
The source emphasizes just how massive this body of water is.
It is the deepest freshwater lake in the entire world. The maximum depth is over 1,600 meters.
Over 1,600 meters. That's more than a mile deep.
A mile of water straight down. It holds roughly 20% of the world's unfrozen freshwater. Like we said earlier, it is effectively an inland sea.
Yeah.
And when it freezes over, it creates this vast, endless white plain that looks as solid as concrete.
And that visual is the trap. You look out and you just see kilometers of flat white surface. It looks completely stable. It doesn't look like this dynamic, shifting, breathing thing that can just swallow a bus hole.
That's what the text refers to as the camouflaged danger.
Right, camouflage danger.
The beauty is what lures people in. Baikal is famous globally for its transparency. In the shallow areas, you can literally look down through a meter of ice and see the stones on the bottom perfectly
It's
clearly.
incredibly photogenic.
But that intense aesthetic appeal completely masks the reality, which is that you are essentially standing on a thin membrane stretched over a mile-deep abyss.
Which makes what happened next in the source so crazy to me. It mentions this wasn't even an isolated incident this winter. Even before this bus tragedy, people were dying out there this season.
Yes, just a few weeks earlier, in late January, another Chinese tourist died when their car overturned on the ice. So the precedent was already set.
Right.
The warnings weren't just theoretical government overreach. They were written in very recent, very tragic history.
Okay, this is the part of the deep dive where I really, really struggle to wrap my head around the human behavior.
The psychology of it all.
Yes, we have this bus tragedy. 8 people are dead. It's international natives. The local governor is basically screaming, do not go on the ice.
It was a massive, high-visibility disaster.
And yet the source says that on the exact same weekend, more people went out.
It is completely baffling, but yes. Governor Kobzev revealed that while the recovery operation for the bus was likely still being actively coordinated, 6 additional people had to be rescued from separate incidents.
Like 6 more vehicles. Or 6 people.
6 people, but involved in multiple separate incidents. Vehicles getting trapped, wheels breaking through the crust, people getting completely stranded out on the ice.
On the same weekend. So while the news is actively reporting bus sinks, 8 dead, other people are in their hotel rooms, packing their gear and driving out onto the exact same lake.
It seems like it entirely defies logic, doesn't it? But this is exactly where we get into the psychology of what you might call the vacation brain.
I was going to ask, is it just arrogance? Like, oh, it won't happen to me.
That's a huge part of it, yeah. It's called optimism bias. As humans, we are basically hardwired to believe that we are statistically luckier or smarter than the average person.
That bus driver made a mistake, but I'm a careful driver.
Exactly. They went to the dangerous spot, but we are going to the safe spot.
But surely the sight of, I don't know, rescue helicopters flying overhead or the news reports on the radio would shatter that bias.
You would certainly think so. But you have to consider the sunk cost fallacy here as well. These tourists likely traveled thousands of miles. They spent a lot of money on flights, on visas, on hotels.
Yeah, there's a big investment.
And they usually have a very limited window of time, maybe 2 or 3 days total, to get the experience.
So the intense pressure to validate all that expense and effort actually overrides their basic survival instinct.
Completely. The human brain does these incredible mental gymnastics. It tells you, I can't have come all this way for nothing. So they subconsciously weigh the absolute certainty of disappointment if they don't go on the ice against the abstract probability of danger.
And since the ice looks so solid to the naked eye, they gamble that the probability of danger is practically 0.
Exactly.
It's that whole Instagram versus reality conflict playing out in real time. The reward is the memory, the amazing photo, the story to tell back home. The risk is totally abstract, right up until the front wheel punches through the ice.
And remember, the environment actively reinforces this bad decision. If you drive out to the edge of the lake and see other cars out on the ice, which they almost certainly did, you immediately get social proof.
Look, those guys are out there and they're fine. It must be safe.
Right. It creates this deadly feedback loop of bad decision-making among groups of strangers.
It's terrifying because it's just so incredibly human. Like, I could honestly see myself in that situation. Maybe not driving a van onto a banned Siberian lake, but certainly ignoring a high surf warning at the beach because I really wanted to swim, or hiking a trail that was technically closed because the view at the top is supposed to be amazing.
We all do it in different ways. We tend to treat safety regulations in nature like they're gentle suggestions rather than actual laws of physics.
Right.
We think the governor is just being a strict bureaucrat trying to stop everyone from having fun. We don't realize he's literally trying to stop us from dying.
Governor Kobzev seemed genuinely frustrated in the source material. He said, and this is a quote, "Sadly, even this tragedy hasn't taught people a lesson."
That is the deep frustration of someone who truly knows the lake. To the locals who live there, the ice is almost a living entity. It demands absolute respect.
But to the tourist, it's just a platform for a photo.
Yes. And that massive disconnect in perception is exactly where the danger lives.
It also really highlights the critical role of the guides. If you are a tourist visiting a place like this, you are entirely relying on the local expert to keep you alive. If that expert is just a random guy with a van who really wants your cash, you are putting a terrifying amount of trust in a stranger.
That is probably the biggest key takeaway for anyone listening who travels off the beaten path. The source heavily emphasizes the governor's plea. Only use authorized tour operators.
It's not just about obeying the local laws.
No, it's about accessing institutional knowledge of safety. The authorized guides know where the common fissures open up. They talk to each other on radios. They know exactly when a slight temperature shift makes the ice fundamentally unstable.
Whereas the independent driver's basically flying blind.
Worse than flying blind. They are flying blind and highly motivated by a quick payout. They have a massive financial incentive to say yes to you when they really should be saying no.
Which brings us back to that core concept of the fatal fissure. It's such a violent, descriptive image. A crack implies a break, but a fissure implies a complete separation of the earth.
It's the ground literally opening up to swallow you. In the context of Baikal, these fissures can stretch for kilometers across the lake. They are the breathing lines of the ice.
Wow.
And if you happen to be on the wrong side of one, or in this tragic case, driving directly over one as it shifts, no amount of defensive driving skill is going to save you.
It really challenges that whole arrogant idea of conquering nature. We always talk about conquering a mountain or conquering a wilderness trek, but you don't conquer Lake Baikal.
You really don't.
You just survive it, if it lets you.
Nature is utterly indifferent to us. That is the harsh lesson we somehow have to keep relearning as a species. The lake doesn't care about your tight vacation schedule. It doesn't care that you're a good person or that you have a family waiting for you back home.
Right.
If the underlying physics dictate that the ice splits in that exact moment, it splits.
So we have 8 lives lost, an entire community in mourning, a local governor pleading for basic sanity, and a winter tourism season that is incredibly still ongoing right now.
And likely, despite all this horrible news, more people will still try to go out on the banned ice. That is the really sad reality of these bucket list destinations. The allure is just too strong for some people to resist.
It's a very heavy story today, but I think it's a necessary one to examine. We so often just scroll past these kinds of headlines on our phones. Bus accident in Siberia, and we don't stop to think about the actual terrifying mechanics of it. The 3-meter gap opening up, the dark freezing water, the small human decisions that led to them getting in that van.
It's a stark reminder to always do your due diligence when you travel. Check the actual regulations, not just what a vendor tells you. Don't ever assume that just because you can buy a ticket for something, it's inherently safe.
Right.
And sometimes you just have to be willing to accept that you can't get the photo.
Because it's a lot better to come home disappointed without the photo than to not come home at all.
Precisely.
Before we wrap up today, I want to leave you, the listener, with something to mull over. We've spent this whole time analyzing the poor decisions of these tourists and the awful tragedy that followed. And it's really easy to sit back and judge them from the total safety of your morning commute or your living room.
Oh, absolutely.
But the underlying psychology that led them on to that ice is the exact same psychology that governs a lot of our everyday lives.
You mean the optimism bias?
That, and just our general inability to properly assess invisible risks. We all tend to act as if nothing bad will ever happen to us, right up until the moment it does. So the question I want to leave you with is this. Where in your own life are you currently driving on thin ice just because you see everyone else doing it?
That's a great question. Is it a financial risk? A health risk?
Exactly. Are you ignoring the warning cracks forming around you just because the view from where you're standing is really nice?
It's so easy to do.
It is. Because if a tragedy involving 8...
Okay, one question for you. What specific safety failures led to the minibus driving onto dangerously thin ice on Lake Baikal? And were there clear warning systems or barriers in place to prevent tourists from accessing unsafe areas? Don't forget to comment it. Thanks.